Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Thursday everybody. In Beijing's first significant reaction to the new Lai administration in Taipei, early this morning, local time, the Eastern Theater Command of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, PLA, started joint military drills surrounding Taiwan. According to state media, the drills were conducted in the Taiwan Strait, quote, the north, south and east of Taiwan Island, as well as areas around the islands of Kunming, Matsu, Wuqiu, and Dongyin, end quote. The spokesperson for the Theater Command said military services, including the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force of the Theater Command, are being organized to conduct joint drills, codenamed Joint Sword 2024A, from Thursday through Friday. The spokesperson explained that the drills focus on joint sea-air combat readiness patrol, joint seizure of comprehensive battlefield control, and joint precision strikes on key targets, adding that the exercises involve the patrol of vessels and planes closing in on areas around the island and integrated operations inside and outside the island chain to test the joint real combat capabilities of the forces of the command. And critically, the spokesperson also said the drills, quote, serve as a strong punishment for the separatist acts of Taiwan independent forces and a stern warning against the interference and provocation by external forces, end quote. The name of the exercise, Joint Sword 2024A, suggests there will be more than one this year. Beijing has labelled the new president, Lai Ching-te, or William Lai, a separatist and troublemaker over remarks he made in the past supporting Taiwanese independence. In his inauguration address on Monday, Lai called on China to stop threatening Taiwan. All in all, this is a concerning sign of what's to come for cross-strait tensions during this new Lai era. Quote, Lai faces an array of challenges that will test his team. Foremost is the risk of a vicious cycle of escalation between Beijing and Taipei. Beijing may have written Lai off long ago, refusing to believe that he could be a trusted interlocutor who will exercise adequate restraint. Lai, who undoubtedly believes that he has acted in a restrained manner that has gone unnoticed in Beijing, may deviate from Tsai's approach, at least rhetorically, seeing little reason to adjust to accommodate Beijing's preferences. End quote. Next up, moving from one dangerous region to another, in a curious and frankly unflattering episode, the UK and the US, close military and intelligence allies, have sent very mixed messages about China providing lethal aid to Russia for its war in Ukraine. Grant Shapps, SHAPPS, Secretary of State for Defense of the United Kingdom on yesterday, accused China of providing or preparing to provide Russia with lethal aid for use by Moscow in its war against Ukraine, expressing, quote, today I can reveal that we have evidence that Russia and China are collaborating on combat equipment for use in Ukraine, end quote, adding that the weapons flows were, quote, a significant development, end quote. If true, this would be a tremendous escalation, provoking a strong reaction from the US and Europe. However, soon after this statement from the UK, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said Washington had not observed that China had directly provided weapons to Russia, and added that he would speak to his UK colleagues to better understand the Defense Secretary's comments. US officials have previously said China had technically not provided direct lethal aid, but that Beijing was supplying Russia with technology that was assisting in the war, and in some cases was dual use. Providing lethal aid is a bright red line the US has set out and communicated to Beijing. So what happened? The most likely explanation is that the UK had bad intelligence, which would be strange considering how close sharing is between London and Washington. Or that the intelligence is accurate, but that Washington is not yet prepared to act on this bright red line. China continues to firmly push back against these types of accusations and claims that it is a fully neutral party in the conflict. China's Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, speaking to the UN Security Council yesterday, expressed, quote, unlike the US, we have not and will not deliberately prolong the conflict and profit from it. Our position is to promote peace talks and a political settlement. End quote. we will continue to follow this particular story as it unfolds. Next up, and finally for today's episode, the main story, we look at the Chinese economy and specifically the housing crisis and how it is mutating into a political one. The big economic news of the month is of course last Friday's rollout of Beijing's biggest measures yet to shore up the housing sector, a sign of just how concerned leadership in Beijing has become on this question of housing and its political fallout. This week has seen intense debate on the question of whether this will be enough to turn the housing crisis and by extension the economy around. Now before we jump into this, if you're enjoying today's episode of China Update, it's a huge help if you can hit the like button. Subscribing is a big help too. Only about 45% of regular viewers are subscribed, and Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Zhu Haibin, Hong Kong-based chief China economist at US bank JP Morgan, said at a briefing on Wednesday that it's too soon to call Beijing's rescue package a game changer, explaining that expectations about an extended decline in home prices and shrinking incomes among wealthy families, plus jitters about the ability of cash-strapped private developers to deliver homes, will continue to keep home buyers at bay. Quote, "It remains to be seen whether the measures will be a game changer for the property market. We are cautious about the possibility that the property market will stabilize or rebound. A recovery may need more time than expected." End quote. Others argue that the support is just too small. Harry Murphy-Cruz, an economist at Moody's Analytics, expressed in a note this week, quote, "This is a drop in the ocean given the scale of unsold stock." End quote. Goldman Sachs estimated last week that, based on cost, China has 30 trillion RMB of unsold housing inventory, spanning land and completed apartments, equivalent to 10 times the amount sold last year. Nationwide, China has about 400 million square meters of newly completed but unsold flats. At the current sell-through rate, it will take about 30 months for the market to fully digest. This is a lot higher than the 1-year threshold that the industry deems is necessary for property prices to stabilize. Quote, "No matter how you slice and dice it, it just seems the size and scale of the problem is a lot bigger than at least what we can see of the central government's committed funding. The maths shows there is an oversupply problem in the housing market." End quote. But of course Beijing is attempting a tremendously difficult balancing trick. Quote, "This is not like the giant financial crisis where the Federal Reserve comes out to buy all the troubled assets of the financial institutions. What China is trying to do is much more targeted because it still has to combat moral hazard and be careful not to reinflate the bubble." End quote. But this raises the question, just what can Beijing do? Bubbles tend to only go two ways. They inflate or they pop. Some commentators are hopeful, however. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post reports this week that, quote, "Sentiment in China's property market is improving, with home buyers in some of the biggest cities rushing to sales offices to scout for deals, days after Beijing rolled out the strongest stimulus measures yet to rescue the troubled sector." End quote. What is critical in that statement, however, is some of the biggest cities. Not all cities. As US-based Bloomberg explains today, quote, "China's housing market is complex, with big variations from city to city. A few can come out of the slump as early as this year, while others may struggle with vast numbers of empty flats, perhaps even decades down the road." End quote. And this disparity is the key thing to understand, not just on the economic question, but on political questions too. Quote, "This economic divergence is true about much more than housing. 6 to 7 provinces in the east have relatively high incomes, diversified economies, meaningful growth prospects, debt levels that are high but manageable, and growing working populations. The rest of the country is much poorer, with unsustainable debt levels and rapidly contracting working populations as young people immigrate. These are also the areas where, on the assumption that infrastructure investment could be the cause of growth and not its cost, much of the previous overbuilding in housing and infrastructure occurred. Because of the resulting surge in debt relative to economic activity, infrastructure investment can no longer be used to generate anywhere near the economic activity it had in the past. This suggests that far from economic convergence, China is likely to see continued divergence. This is as much a political issue as it is an economic one, but I am not sure how Beijing will respond." End quote. Both this massive disparity, as well as shrinking wealth generally, are political problems stemming from this economic crisis. As Tom Ehrlich, chief economist for Bloomberg Economics, points out this week, quote, "The bulk of household wealth is held in real estate, and property markets have been in a slow-motion collapse, with apartments in some cities losing half of their value since the 2021 peak. Chinese stocks are down more than a third over the same period." End quote. This is already spilling into public anger too. Protests on the economy, especially the housing crash, have become more frequent. According to Freedom House's China Dissent Monitor, they made up some 80% of the almost 3,000 public expressions of dissent recorded by researchers in 2023. And those are just the ones that they know about. This is still very manageable for Beijing, but it's a troubling trend for policymakers. Anthony Seitz, a professor of Chinese government at Harvard University, who has been visiting China since 1976, observed this week, quote, "I have never seen or heard such a high level of annoyance and frustration among China's middle class." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.